Hello everybody. Today I am going to deliver a lecture on cultural geography. So before understanding the cultural geography, you must know the definition of culture. So culture can be defined as a total way of life of people. It is the total way of life of people, their dress, food habits, music, housing style, and most important of all is the values. You must have heard about the high culture, the popular culture, and then there is also a resistance to this high culture and popular culture that is known as counterculture. Counterculture, the best example of the counterculture is the black culture or the folk culture. So, and the folk culture or the Western culture or the uh, corporate culture. So, and between all of them there is a complex and quite exciting process which is known as cultural politics. Cultural politics means it is basically the way our lives are structured. The, it is a way in which our lives are structured. So now we will go to the definition, some more critical definition of culture. So culture seems to be both a structure of feeling and a set of production, or in other words art. So structure of feeling means that defines the life of people, the life of which defines the life of people, or perhaps the constructed out of people life. The other is the set of production, which is also known as art. That is a reflection. It is a reflection upon or speak to or an attempt to mold that structure of feeling through various strategies of the representation. Another definition of culture is also known as the recursive set of relationship that determines how we lead our lives. It is the recursive set of relationships that determines how we lead our lives. More simple, if you want to understand the concept of culture, so culture is something which is the opposite of nature. Culture means there, if a thing which, if there is no nature, opposite of the nature is culture. So there are six ways in which we can understand the culture in more critical terms. First is what makes humans human. What makes human. The second way of understanding culture is the way of life. And the third is the process by which these patterns of way of life developed. Fourth one is the set of markers. We call it set of markers. For example, set of marker means like I am Indian, I am American. Example. The fifth is the way that all these patterns, processes, markers are represented in the space. Represented in the space. And the most important, the last one, is the idea of culture. Idea of culture indicates the hierarchical ordering of all these process, activities, way of life, and cultural production. So idea of culture is basically indicates the hierarchy means the stepwise, the ordering of the classes, of the things, of the institution, of all these processes and activities, the way of life, and the cultural production. In this slide here you can see the most appropriate definition of culture, which is culture is understood both as a way of life encompassing ideas, attitudes, language, practices, institutions, and structure of power, and whole range of cultural practices like artistic forms, text, canons, architecture, mass produced commodities, and so forth, as said by Nelson in 1992. So, to understand why we think the way we do now as a geographer, it is essential to understand the historical and social foundation of our thought. It is very necessary for geographers to understand the historical and social foundation of our thought. So, if we look at the history, the geographical history of the cultural geography, so the age of cultural geography in the domain of discipline, it, it mainly established after an essay written by Carlos Saar, which is known as the morphology of landscape. And another essay was known as the agency of man on earth. It was written in 1956. 1956. So in this morphology of landscape, Carlos Sir was different, has have a different opinion in opposite to the environmental determinism. Environmental determinism was the philosophy in geography which says that the behavior of the humans is determined by the nature, whereas Carlos Sir was in the opinion that there is a cultural landscape. There is a cultural landscape created by the humans which can be shaped and reshaped every day with the work and the production. So the tradition of cultural geography Colosser initiated have proved exceptionally durable, and new developments in cultural geography continually have had to come to terms with them. In Colosser work, we can trace many of the prominent themes that dominated cultural geography in 20th century: a concern with material landscape, an interest in cultural ecology, and often deleterious effects of humans on environment, a desire to trace the origins and diffusion of revolutionary culture practice such as plants and animals and domestication and use of fire. So if we look at the words of Carlos Sir, he was basically the opposite of the industrial development, and he was more into the rural landscape, the different places and the uniqueness. He believed in the opinion of the regions or the cultural realms or the cultural landscapes. It wasn't nature that caused culture. It wasn't nature that caused culture, but rather culture working with and on nature created the context of life. Carlosser was especially concerned with the material aspects of the culture, particularly the landscape. So, for the first time, he gave the concept of cultural landscape, in which he says that it wasn't nature that caused culture, but he mean to say there is no role of nature in construction of culture, but rather culture working with and on nature creating the context of life. Carlos Sarver was especially concerned with the material aspects of the culture, particularly the landscape.